Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series, Reflections in Time, was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960 and served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. Good morning. It's a lovely day in November. The year's 2002, and I have here as my guest Professor James Thorson of the gerontology department here at UN Omaha. Jim, welcome. We're glad to have you with us.
Thanks, Jack. I'm glad to be here.
You're currently a professor and chairman of the Department of Gerontology, I think.
And have been seemingly for a very long time. I've been here since 1977, and I became director of what was then the program in gerontology in 1979. We became a department in 1985, and I assumed the title chairman. So I guess I've been running the show there for over 20 years. They'll probably hear this and decide it's time to get rid of me.
Well, let's hope not. You, in addition to being a professor and chairman of the department, have the distinction of holding a named professorship, I think.
Jacob Isaacson, who was a prominent citizen in the 30s and 40s, left funding to provide some endowed professorships at Creighton and at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, which of course was Omaha University back in those days. And I believe there are a number of Isaacson scholarships too. So I am in a term as an Isaacson professor.
And you also hold rank at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
The Lincoln campus pays 10% of my salary, and for that reason I have a professorship there. Although all my activities are on this campus with gerontology, I do chair doctoral dissertations for people in the Community and Human Resources doctoral program who specialize in gerontology. And for that reason I'm a professor of educational administration, a field I've never taken a course in, and now I'm a professor of, which I find charming. But I guess I've been doing it for over 25 years, so...
So that should qualify you, right?
It comes out in the wash.
You know, I've known you a long time, Jim. In fact, we even spent a week together traversing the Grand Canyon in a raft not too long ago.
You learn a lot about people when they're in their underwear in the river.
Right. But despite all these years that I've known you, I've never really talked to you much about your background. Could you tell me a little about where you come from? And,
I was born in Chicago. I tell people here that we chose Omaha for small-town living, which is often greeted with a hoot, because it seems to me like almost everyone in Omaha is from O'Neill or Valentine or Scotts Bluff. But Omaha reminds me of Chicago when I was a kid. The north side of Chicago was very much like Omaha is in a lot of ways. It's a livable community, and we really love Omaha, and it has the cultural advantages you'd find in a very big city, and few of the disadvantages. Plus, you can get where you need to go in 20 minutes. So when people gripe about Omaha, I think, oh, you don't know. This is a wonderful place to live. But Chicago is where my wife and I come from. I went to school at Northern Illinois, got my bachelor's degree there. Then we entered VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America, after I graduated in 1967. And we were stationed in North Carolina, in Statesville, North Carolina, worked in a little community there, a little mill town area of the rural South, really, until the next year when I took a job, as my mother said, a real job rather than a volunteer position, in an anti-poverty program in the mountains of North Carolina, in Asheville. I directed something called Operation Mainstream. That was a Labor Department funded program. I had 30 Appalachian white male enrollees, and the notion was to teach them job skills. Well, that was wonderful, living in the mountains of North Carolina. Unfortunately, I could see that we weren't going to win the war on poverty, and my own situation was that I was getting deeper into it. Seeking a way to improve our situation, I found that the United States Administration on Aging had fellowships to study gerontology at the graduate level, and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill had such a program, a career training program. Now, we had a similar kind of a thing at UNO going on at the same time, but I didn't know anything about UNO. Well, I got my master's degree at North Carolina and specialized in aging, and then went to the University of Georgia and took a position as an instructor of adult education, half with the College of Education and half with the Center for Continuing Education. The University of Georgia had a Kellogg Center very similar to the one on the East Campus at UNL. The difference is that at Georgia it worked. So they're not closing it down. I was in charge of educating people around the state, particularly those in service programs for the elderly, on gerontology and various aspects of services for the elderly. And this was a kind of a yeasty time in our history. The 1965 White House Older Americans Act had provided some services in a very small way, but after the 1971 White House Conference on Aging, and 71 happened to be when I went to Georgia, there was a national policy. Let us provide services to keep people in their own homes for as long as possible, independent, and provide alternatives to institutional care. Well, that involves quite a lot, and funding began to emerge to have area agencies on aging in different counties. So I pretty much covered the state of Georgia for about 6 years, and in the meantime I worked on a doctorate part-time. So I got my doctorate there in 1975. Well,
this answers the question I was going to ask you about how you got interested in gerontology. But I'm a little curious, how did you get interested in that VISTA program that got you started out?
Well, that's interesting. I had trained to be in advertising and marketing, and I decided it was immoral. The things that people have in their minds when they go to college. I had a student one time who did a full 3.5 years of elementary education and then did her practice teaching and found out she hated children. Well,
so this is what you majored in?
I majored in business at Northern Illinois and market research and advertising. I never went into it. I interviewed in a few places, and I could see this is not for me, and I decided on a career change before I even had a career. Now, as fate would have it, I graduated, I guess, in May of '67, and the VISTA program didn't really begin till mid-September, so we needed something to do. And my wife and I took jobs in a nursing home in our home community, actually her home in Niles, Illinois, just north of Chicago. She's a registered nurse, and they were happy to have her, and I think they took me to get her, and I learned how to be an orderly on the job, and thus I tell my students I learned gerontology from the bottom up. Well, it was a wonderful experience, and just seeing the sociology of the interchange between people and the different values that were placed on people according to whether or not they had cognitive capacity. It gave me a host of things to share with my students that I still use in my lectures. It was a wonderful experience.
You said you came to Omaha in 1977. How did that happen?
Well, I was on the faculty at the University of Georgia. I had been active in grant writing and doing some publishing even before I got my doctorate. And the University of Georgia was very, very happy with the grants that I brought in. And they had an anti-inbreeding rule. An inbreeding rule meaning that they didn't want to have a lot of their own graduates on the faculty. You get
yeah, that's
only
fairly
the
common
same
in a lot
thoughts.
of places.
Yeah, you want to bring in new thinking from other places. Well, they waived that in my case, and I became the august rank of assistant professor. And I was very proud of myself, and they made me a graduate faculty member, and I was on doctoral committees and so on. I was about the only gerontologist they had. A wise man on my own doctoral committee said, "Today's the day you look for other work." I said, "They've just promoted me." And he said, "How long do you think it will take for you to become an associate professor or a full professor?" Having just had to move heaven and earth to get assistant professor. So, I had interviews at Louisville, Houston, UNO, University of Oklahoma, and the University of Connecticut. And the University of Connecticut called and said, "Jim, you're the best man for the job. We've just offered it to a woman." But I did have some offers in other places, and at Houston I would have been the only gerontologist in the College of Home Economics. At Oklahoma I would have been the only adult educator in a College of Education. But UNO had a program in gerontology, and they made me an offer that was considerably better than what I had at Georgia, and I would have colleagues to interact with and talk about things, do research in a collaborative way with other people. That was important, and UNO was already well established in terms of gerontology when I came here in 1977.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, who was the...
Dave Peterson had come here in 1972. An old fellow named Clark Tibbetts, who was a famous gerontologist, had been in charge of the career training program for the U.S. Administration on Aging. That was part of health, education, and welfare at that time. And he was in the business of distributing grants around the country, similar to the one that I'd been on as a student at North Carolina, that were multi-year grants to get gerontology departments off the ground. And they would pay a portion of faculty salaries, plus they would pay student stipends to lure students into the field. I think the largest grant that UNO ever had was $120,000 a year, but back in those days that was major money. And it was a multi-year thing. It lasted 5 years, and I believe that we got a continuation of another 2 before we were all off of the federal dole and onto the state appropriation. Well, now there's some interesting history that I've got to share with you on this. In the beginning, in the early 1970s, when there were lots of federal dollars around, teachers' corps and you name it, there were lots of new things starting at universities, and as the Dean of Arts and Sciences, you well remember the new things coming along. But the problem becomes, what do you do after the federal money runs out? And do you continue it with state funding? That was the implication of the career training grant from AOA, that it would be reduced a little bit each year until finally you were weaned off of the federal money and you had to take it over with state funding. Well, not everyone has state funding for such a thing, and at North Carolina, when the federal money left, so did the program. Peterson was fairly clever about these kinds of things. He got lots of different grants, but still, if it's all federal money, it's a house of cards. You want to have tenure-track faculty who have a state salary, who can depend on being there year after year, so that they could pursue their own research program and not have to worry about where the next year's salary will come from. We had an interesting, fascinating man on the faculty at that time named Leo Massini. Leo was a Belgian. He's now retired. He's 74 years old. I communicated with him earlier this week via email. He's still active, writing and translating his own books. He was a priest, a member of the White Fathers of Africa, and had been in the Congo, which became Zaire, which now is, again, the Republic of the Congo. In Kinshasa, he was the Dean of Education and Psychology for Louvanium University, which was a branch of his own university in Louvain, Belgium. Well, when Lumumba took over and the Belgians were no longer welcome in the Congo, he needed somewhere to go. And it turns out that then Mayor Alves was married to Leo's cousin. And one thing led to another, and Leo came to Omaha. He began teaching in the Goodrich Scholarship Program, which is in the same college, College of Public Affairs and Community Services, with gerontology. And it developed that he knew something about gerontology. It also developed that he had extraordinary political skills. And having Alves as an entree, he became fast friends with a number of politically powerful people in the state of Nebraska, one of whom was Terry Carpenter. And some Nebraskans may remember Senator Terry Carpenter.
Terrible Terry, they used to call him.
From Terrytown, out in Scotts Bluff. And apparently Terry Carpenter had the kind of power or the kind of clout that we grew up on back in Chicago with Mayor Daley. I don't know all the details, but I do know that in 1974, both Peterson and Leo Massini have shared this story with me, so I believe it's true. They went to Carpenter's office and met with him and said, we're in a program that's been going for a couple of years over at UNO that's entirely federally funded, and we need a state appropriation. Now, this was going right around Ronald Roskins, who was a chancellor and then president of this, and I'm sure was infuriating. But Carpenter said, well, how much do you need? Well, Peterson had added up the salaries of all his faculty and the fringe benefits, and he said, I need $161,412.15. Carpenter says, you don't need any more than that? Peterson said, no, that's how much I need. He says, well, you've got it. On the way out, Carpenter says to Massini, the silly ass could have had $500,000. Well, it turns out to be probably a pretty good thing, because if he'd gotten $500,000, it would have been ripe for plucking back when things fell apart in 1982, and we had a very difficult time on this campus, similar to the budget crisis that we've had to live through this year and presumably next year. But gerontology then became solidified as not just a federal program that was an add-on like Teacher Corps, which came and went, but it was an actual academic program of the university. And then, of course, as I mentioned to you, by 1985 we became a department, and we offer a master's degree in gerontology. Mostly what we offer is a certificate, which is the credential that's recognized around the country. Certificate at the undergraduate level, which is kind of an add-on to other majors. We've got quite a few psychology majors, people in sociology, undergraduate social workers, nurses, and so on, who add gerontology to their curriculum, and thus become a specialist. Or we do it at the graduate level, where we have quite a few people in social work, counseling, therapeutic recreation, some other disciplines. And then we have our people who take gerontology only and get an MA. And actually, I counted up yesterday, we've had 33 PhDs.
That's a good record.
Well, yeah, you do 2 or 3 a year, and after a while it mounts up. Yeah.
That's quite a bit of work, though. How many faculty members are there currently in that department?
Currently, we've got 5.9, actually 5.4. We have one person who is on half-time retirement. We, of course, like many departments at UNO, we have to rely on some part-time instructors. What we try to do is get practitioners from the field to fill in those niche areas where we can't afford to have a full-time person. Legal aspects of aging is a perfect example. We couldn't afford to have an attorney full-time on our faculty, but it is a critical piece of a curriculum. So we have a person in the community who is an attorney, who has a practice where he has quite a few seniors and knows of their problems. So he's able to deal with the practical, everyday legal issues that come along. We have a nursing home administrator, similarly, who teaches a course on long-term care administration, a nutritionist, a woman who runs a hospice, those kinds of things where we can expand our offerings and go beyond the usual sociology and psychology of aging.
So you have a part of your program then where you depend on these part-time people with extensive experience in the field. And I suppose that's very good for the students to be to have an opportunity to work with people who are doing that kind of work in the community.
We have some interesting things happen in terms of eyes opening. We have a recent endowment to the department, a wonderful gift of $650,000 to support scholarships and ultimately a professorship. And it was given by an individual in the community who had his own insurance agency and decided late in life, well, late in his career, he's only 65 now, so he's not in late life, that he wanted to earn a master's degree. He'd always had the ambition to go to graduate school, and it was now or never. And he chose gerontology. And he said on his first field trip to a continuing care retirement community, it opened his eyes. He had always thought of institutional care for older people as simply being nursing homes. And I think a lot of people have kind of the poor farm / asylum vision of the nursing home. And he saw that there are multiple levels of services to older people, where some people are in their own apartments, then they really get no services other than being in a sheltered environment, all the way on up to assisted care, skilled care, and Alzheimer's units, according to their needs along a continuum of care. And he was able to, in fact, to find a very nice environment for his own mother. He'd feared that she was going into some undesirable snake pit atmosphere, and apparently she's really quite happy with the very nice services. I should say Omaha is very well fixed for these kinds of services. It's a relatively advanced community for community-based services as well as institutional continuing care retirement communities.
I guess we're very fortunate then in that regard.
Well, compared to other cities that I'm familiar with, yes.
How many undergraduate majors do you have? You said many of your students are in other majors and take gerontology courses, but how many full-time majors?
I don't know. We have 95 on the books, but we have the continual frustration of the department chair, the shadow student, the person who's had 4 courses in your department and has yet to sign up. And they continually complain that they don't get good advising, and I say, we didn't know who you were.
You would have had it if we'd seen you.
If we had your name and address, we could have sent you the schedule. We'd do it to all the people on the list. So, and then of course there are the people on the list who decided that they needed to move to San Diego, and they never told us that they left. We take a look actually at the number who finish every year, which is, it ranges between 2 and 3 dozen.
Yeah.
The master's program is small, perhaps because we talk people into going into a direct service master's if they're going to go into direct service. Sure. If they're going to be in nursing home administration, we'd just as soon see them in public administration, for example, or social work, or counseling. And we tried to look on the MA in gerontology as more of a research degree, where we prepare them to be researchers, and often they go on for a doctorate then. So
I get the impression that there's a good bit of research going on then among the faculty in your department.
Oh yeah, we've had a number of people receive the Adroka Award, is it? Award for Outstanding Research or Creative Activity.
You received one of those yourself.
I did about 10 years ago. Yeah. Dr. Kozlowski in our faculty received it last year. We've got pretty good grant activity in terms of support from the National Institute on Aging, a couple of subcontracts from other universities that are doing multi-university projects. An interesting one right now, for example, Carl Kozlowski will be reporting on this research next week at the Gerontological Society meeting in Boston. He just gave me a copy of his paper. Curious that he wrote the paper before he gave it, which we always love to see. He was part of a 33-state evaluation of Alzheimer's support systems that were funded by the U.S. Administration on Aging. The main grant went to the University of Kansas, but he was the methodologist for the entire national grant. And they have found, in terms of the support that caregivers need to receive in order to keep people in their own homes. I've got a very good friend right now, as an illustration, whose wife has Alzheimer's disease. He is, I think, 72 and she's 70. He's in good health. Physically, she's quite capable, but she's losing her cognitive abilities. So much so that we were at lunch there not too long ago, and I asked her for a spoon. We were making something in the kitchen. She couldn't find a spoon in her own kitchen. She'd forgotten which drawer they were kept in, and it was very sad to see. Well, with certain kinds of supports, he's been able to keep her at home longer than you might ordinarily suspect. And of course, the last thing you want to do is turn to nursing home care, because it's so expensive. It can range from $36,000 to $60,000 a year, and hardly anyone has the resources to pay for that for very long. So people typically will get to their end of their rope and go beyond, knocking themselves out to keep mom at home. And of course, the stereotype of dumping people in a nursing home is exactly wrong. People go as far as they possibly can. Well, if you see families running out of rope, the secret is give them more rope. Bring in visiting nurses, bring in home-delivered meals, therapists and others that can provide respite, home programs or adult daycare programs. These are the kinds of things, and they've been able to demonstrate the cost-effectiveness of these kinds of things through this national grant.
What are your own research interests these days? Have you you've been keeping up, I'm sure?
Well, yeah, I try to get a few articles and maybe a chapter or two out every year. I've got a pretty good deal going with a publisher on a gerontology text. It's in the 2nd edition, and we're keeping careful files to update it, of course, for the 3rd edition. But my own research has been, over the course of time, looking at how people cope as a general theme.
Sure.
If you stop to think about the problems that are associated with aging, not everyone should focus on the problems, but the inevitable kinds of things that happen late in life with declining sensory ability, declining status, declining stature, declining physical abilities, greater likelihood to have chronic illness, greater likelihood to become bereaved, greater likelihood to become institutionalized, and so on. All of these are problems that many of us dread. And when we interview older people, we find some of the happiest, most satisfied people, wise people who have identified their purpose in life and have no particular fears of dying and are getting along very well indeed. Well, now, in a nation where whining is the national sport, how is it that this older generation is doing so well, particularly compared to the baby boomers that I belong to, where we seem to need hand-holding at every time we turn around. So I started looking at how older people cope with their problems, and I thought the biggest problem probably that we have to confront is death. Let's take a look at death anxiety. And in the early 80s, I found some deficiency in the then existing death anxiety scales. So I worked with Dr. Chuck Powell on our faculty to make a revised death anxiety scale. And it's caught on and is used, and it's in several languages now, on the theory that death is a multi-dimensional kind of a thing. In other words, there's more to it than the then existing scale by, there was a fellow named Donald Templer from California who had a scale that measured claustrophobia, the fear of being shut up in a coffin. Well, there's that, plus there's the fear of decomposition, the fear of the pain of dying, the fear of not being, the fear of an uncertainty of an afterlife, and you name, as a matter of fact, the personal construct psychologists could probably have a field day with the various layers of meaning of what does death mean to different people. Well, with a multidimensional scale, we're able to find out. It turns out that older people, if they do have a fear, it's the uncertainty of an afterlife, whereas younger people fear the pain and the decomposition and the loss of control or mastery that's associated with the dying process and with death itself. But we also found that women tend to have much higher death anxiety than men. They're socialized into having to look beautiful. I mean, you're an awful person if you're not beautiful in our society. And, I mean, we even have Botox injections so people will look like they have Parkinson's disease rather than have the wrinkles that God gave them. It's really madness, but let's face it, youth is good. And so if you don't look youthful, then you are bad. Well, older people are able to finally laugh this off and think, how silly this is. Whereas younger women tend to think, I'm not going to look very good when I die. Maybe that's one of my fears, is it? Well, after you write enough about death anxiety, you get sick and tired of it. So I thought, well, another way that people cope is with religion. Spiritual values are very important, and we know that they're more important with older people. Now, is this a cohort effect? Were they socialized into being more religious as children and just stayed that way over time? Or were they, do they become more religious? Then that gets you into another problem. How do you measure religiosity? And I won't go into a lot of details on this, but we did find a good scale for that. So I did some work, and it's been well received on spiritual well-being. I've done a couple books on that, as a matter of fact, in later life. The third thing I decided is that nobody studies sense of humor. Why shouldn't I? Because sense of humor is a wonderful way of coping with the kinds of problems that people have. And again, looking at the scales available for the measurement of humor, they were very deficient. They're unidimensional. The one that was used most often is how likely are people to laugh? Well, I've got an aunt who's laughed like an idiot for 82 years, and she's never gotten the joke once. So I maintain that the person who creates the humor has the sense of humor. But there are other dimensions. Do people use it to cope? I have a 91-year-old friend who said, "I'm getting so old I won't buy green bananas." Ah. Now, Freud would say this is an example of philosophical thinking, because she's able to focus on the problem. She's going to die. But she's able to laugh at it. Well, how delicious to give the angel of death a hot foot. See? You can say that I'm unimportant, and thus death is unimportant, or that I have more a more all-encompassing ego than to worry about petty problems like dying. Now, 20-year-olds don't think this way. 80-year-olds might. The lucky ones, the wise ones, I think, have reviewed their lives and found out what's important in life. And one of the interesting things they've found with the centenarian studies, the people who are over 100, is that they tend to have good senses of humor. Now, I don't know if there's a weeding out effect. That is, do the old grumps die off, thus leaving the cheerful people? Or is cheerfulness something that happens? These are problems that we've yet to tease out. But our multidimensional sense of humor scale is now in 16 different languages, and there are 22 doctoral dissertations in places from Australia to Africa going on right now using it. So there's going to be a lot of humor research emerging from this. So it's kind of an exciting area to be in.
These scales sound very interesting, and as, as a psychologist, or at least a former psychologist, I can understand the interest, and I can understand the research use. Do they have practical utility as well as research, as well as being research tools?
Well, practical utility kind of depends on how you think of putting stuff into practice. We have, for example, done this kind of research on coping, which I think is very valuable for counselors.
Okay.
And many of my articles are in the Journal of Clinical Psychology, because I'm interested in seeing that the practitioners are able to put this to use. We've done other kinds of studies, however, where you can see a practical value right now. There's a thing in our field called transfer trauma. People who are moved from one environment to another against their will adapt very poorly. And we've known this ever since failure to thrive was identified in orphanages back in the 1940s. And it was pointed out that the death rates in state mental hospitals were extraordinarily high, and we've had a deinstitutionalization movement that really began in 1954. There were more people in mental hospitals in the United States then than any other year since then. It's gone down from 500,000 to about 80,000 now. Well, the same thing is true in terms of nursing homes. People who are moved against their will to nursing homes die at very high rates. Within 2 years, 70% die. And we need to see how can you minimize the trauma that's associated with a move. So we were approached a few years ago by the administration at the Lancaster Manor, which is the county home in Lincoln. They were building a new facility right next door and closing down their old rattletrap building that had been a hospital dating from the 1870s, on how to conduct a move to minimize the death rate post-move. It had been demonstrated with several studies where old nursing homes had been closed down that the death rate post-move was about 4 times higher. So you can calculate an institution's death rate and say you expect 10 people to die each year, and if 40 people die, well, that's a statistically significant difference that should get your attention. Well, unless your intention is to kill them off, you want to find out how can you best prepare people to adapt to new environments. Well, it's a very practical piece of research, and it was a success. What we did was train the staff to get people to anticipate the move, so it wasn't a surprise. And then when the move came, to make sure that people had the same roommates, thus minimizing one change. You get used to the same snoring pattern of the same roommate. That people were on the same side of the building, from one building to the next, so that the sun was in the right place and the stars and the moon relative to what they were used to. That they had the same services. That was an easy one because the same personnel would move from. But we wanted to make sure that people didn't move from one service in the building to another. That they had the same recreation therapist, the same physical therapist and nurse and so on, and the diet and so on. And of course we tracked this. As a matter of fact, Ellen Davis, who's now on the physician's assistant faculty at the Med Center, was a doctoral student of mine at that time, and this was her dissertation following whether or not it was a success. And indeed, the death rate actually went down the year post-move. Yeah. So we accomplished something practical with our research.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me, as the years go by and you develop a few more gray hairs from what's left on your head, do you find your do you find your attitudes towards aging changing at all?
I'm becoming a lot more tolerant. I was on a panel yesterday with a group for Leadership Omaha where we were talking about diversity. And there were various groups. I guess I was arguing for the cause of the elderly, but there were representatives from other groups. And I found that I'm starting to think of younger people as a lot more judgmental than they've got the right to be. And maybe it's not that problem. Maybe I'm changing. Maybe I'm getting more tolerant. Or maybe things, I've seen enough now that nothing phases me anymore. But I've enjoyed the phases that one goes through. I will become a grandfather for the first time next month, and I'm looking forward to that very much. But I've enjoyed each phase of life more so than the previous one, and I guess I'm having a lot of fun, really.
Now, just out of curiosity, does the discipline of gerontology have any dividing line where you say this person's old and this person's not?
Well, we don't even pay attention to these young sprouts under 65, and people who are 65 to 74 are among the young old. Indeed, they don't, as a group, tend to have very many of the problems associated with being elderly. It's after 75 that you really start to see the problems, and you don't really see high institutionalization rates until after 85. I think that we're in an era in this country of such extraordinary health, an unprecedented level of health, that we're, in fact, there's a fellow at Duke who's been able to measure a declining level of disability. See, disability is really the thing that old people worry about. A lot of older people are the walking wounded. They'll have had a heart attack, or they have hypertension and diabetes, conditions that could kill them, but they're under control, so they feel fine. And in fact, if they're under control, they're not any more likely to kill them than anything else. But they'll say, as long as I can do the things I want to do, in other words, the activities of daily living, as long as their functional ability is intact, as long as they're able to get in a raft and go down the Colorado River, well, they don't feel old at all. Might have a few more aches and pains, might not be able to see or hear quite as well, but doing very well indeed. What we're seeing then is kind of a compression of mortality. We ought to be able to last about 85 years, the biologists tell us. And the survival curve is such that it's becoming, it's difficult to graph with just my hands, but it's becoming more rectangular, where a greater proportion of people are making it that long and then dying fairly quickly, rather than sloping it down like it used to be in an earlier age when, oh, well, we can, you know, go back to the earlier parts of this century when the mortality rate was 15% by age 5. Well, almost all of us can expect to get to be at least 65 now, and fully half of us will live past 75. Then we get to the problem, outliving our brains. This is the next frontier in gerontology, the coping with Alzheimer's disease phenomenon. How are we going to get along if we can no longer master our own thinking? Well, indeed, at 65, only about 1% have a measurable cognitive decline. But by age 90, that's up to about 30%. What happens when most people live to be 90?
Interesting.
Well, that's a big problem that we have to face nationally in that, well, right now, we're in a budget crisis in Nebraska. Why? Because of declining revenues? Well, maybe declining a little bit, but actually it's because of the fastest growing portion of the state budget over the last 20 years. Adult long-term care through the Medicaid program is taking an increasing proportion of the state budget year after year after year. And it's something we have to do. We can't throw people out in the street. But about half of all nursing home costs are paid for by Medicaid. And Medicaid is a program that is 60% federally funded, 40% state funded. So at the university, we see our proportion of the state budget shrinking. When I first arrived here, it was 27%. The University of Nebraska's budget was 27% of the state budget. It's now 16% because of the growth of these other programs.
When you were talking about the what appeared to be a change where there was a kind of a precipitous drop-off instead of a gentle slope in the curve, kind of put me in mind of, who was it? Was it was Oliver Wendell Holmes, I think, that wrote the wonderful one-horse shay?
That was Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., the
yes.
autocrat of the breakfast table, rather than opposed to Junior.
Junior, right.
But we'll quote both of them. The one-horse shay, the deacon, was it the parson or the deacon?
It's been a while. I'm
it just went faster and faster until it fell all apart.
Days.
Yeah. But his son, the Supreme Court Justice, had the most wonderful quote about old age. He took up the study of Greek at age 93. And someone asked him, "Why are you doing that?" And he said, "It's now or never."
Very good. Well, I'm just put in mind for some reason of the fact that in addition to your expertise in gerontology and related fields, you also have a number of avocations. Two in particular I think of is one, your singing career, and the other is your career as an author of a cookbook.
Neither of which pay very well. I did do a cookbook in 1989. I tell you what, the other books I've had, particularly the textbook in gerontology, has been a little bit more consistent. I think the cookbook was on the remainder tables after about 3 months.
You can tell us the name of it. I guess it's too late to put in a plug.
Oh, well, Tough Guys Don't Dice, a cookbook for men who can't cook, William Murrow and Company, 1989, is still available, not from William Murrow and Company. I'm sure that they sent all their copies to the landfill. But I had a fan letter for my gerontology text from someone from the San Diego State University. They use the book there. And she said, "What else have you written?" And I said, "Well, find the cookbook. Go to powells.com, the used bookstore on the internet." And I understand that Amazon.com also sells it used. Unfortunately, a used book doesn't make the author any money. I don't get a nickel out of it. When they sell a used textbook at the bookstore, they make money, but I don't. So the singing career, It pays even less than the cookbook. I've been with the Omaha Symphonic Chorus since 1986, I guess, and I've enjoyed that very much. We tackle music that one doesn't whistle in the shower. We'll be doing the Bach B minor Mass with the orchestra in the Orpheum the December 13th and 14th, and that'll be quite an accomplishment to wade through all 240 pages of that. But it's a good deal of fun to produce something that's actually worth doing.
Let's get back to UNO for a minute here. You've been here for about 25 years now.
25.
What sorts of changes have you seen over the years?
Well, one of the things that you'll probably get from all of your interviewees is the new buildings, and that's a very obvious kind of a thing. But one of the interesting things, I remember being on a campus planning committee with Joe Davis and Roger Sharp and a few of the old guys back in the late 70s. And at that time, the campus landscaping effort had no budget. And we took up a collection, as I recall. Faculty were urged to make a pledge to help with the university. Maybe you remember this. It was a one-year, take it out of your pay kind of a thing. And campus landscaping was one of the categories that you could make your donation to. And I think that the total pledge from the faculty came to about $5,300. Well, when the chap in charge of landscaping found out about this, he suddenly was able to buy new trees. Well, you can buy a lot of saplings for $5,300, and now we're seeing literally the fruit of that investment all over this campus with the beautiful trees that are now getting into their adolescence and adulthood and shading the various walks around the campus. The other thing is that we now have, I think, a fairly permanent budget for gardening. And we've got a master gardener on the staff who does really beautiful things up and down the campus that you didn't used to see. It was a fairly pedestrian campus. Now it's a beautiful campus. And we have visitors from other cities saying, you know, urban campuses are often a few downtown buildings. Roosevelt University in Chicago, Atlanta State, or Georgia State in Atlanta. You take a look at UNO, and it's a beautiful place.
Might even tie this into your academic specialty. One could plant trees as memorials to people who are recently deceased.
Well, I recall my old pal Phil Allen, recently deceased, who was a broadcaster and a fine old fiery liberal, and I said, Phil, I like old guys who plant trees. He says, I do too. I mean, you know, think of that. Investing in the future that you will not be around to see yourself, but the future that's good for humankind.
Well, we're getting close to the end of things now, and we've mentioned a number of people. Let's explore that theme just a little bit. What sorts of memories do you have of specific people at the university, either faculty or administrative people or students or anybody you want to talk about for the last few minutes that we have here?
Well, I have very pleasant memories, of course, of Del Weber, which I think everyone likes Del Weber. And in fact, I had dinner with Del and Luann not too long ago, and he's just recently reelected to the OPPD board. Is very active with the Community Foundation and doing interesting things in retirement. I don't go back as far as some of the people you've interviewed, but I remember some people who were more fun than you might have thought of. Jim Kane from Criminal Justice.
Criminal Justice, yes, I remember him.
Died, it must be 10 years ago now. Wonderful man. Just a lot of fun. I enjoyed Margaret Gesselman, our late graduate dean. I mean,
chairman of the math department.
She was chairman after she was graduate dean, retired a year or two ago. And I was on the executive graduate council for a couple terms, and we plotted and schemed to get a few degree programs approved through the university system, and we enjoyed working together. Of course, we've had some interesting people in CPACs over the years. Bill Wakefield, who's a long-term member of the faculty of criminal justice.
Bill was one of my students back in 1960 when I first came here. So
yes.
I know Bill very well.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was an interviewee in this series.
Yeah, well, Bill knows where the bodies are buried. Yeah, right. We've got Smiling Sam Walker, probably one of the most productive faculty members on the campus.
And he has not yet been interviewed, but I've got to catch him one of
Well,
these
you
days.
do, yeah. I think the world of his writing and his continuing practical research. What you get at a university is a group of people who inspire one another. And I don't know if anyone's thought about that particular perspective on it. But I've talked to retirees. Darrell Kellums, for example, has had me speak to one of his Golden K retirement groups several times. He says, you know, I miss being around you guys, meaning, you know, the professors, and kicking around ideas. You know, being at a university.
And see if Darrell's been interviewed in this.
Well, there, you know, you start making notes.
Maybe he
now.
could come in his bunny suit, or.
That would be a great thing. Yeah. Well, you find this at a university that people stimulate each other, and it gets to be a yeasty kind of an atmosphere. And it's been an honor to work in this kind of an environment. Really, very satisfying career.
How about specific changes you've seen?
Well, what we've seen at UNO is the maturation of an institution that I think was looked on pretty much as a part-time commuter school that was a place to sort of patch together a degree if you couldn't really go to college. And while we still have that kind of bootstrapper function, what we're starting to see is...
Just told I've got to wrap this up. So I thank you very much, Jim.
Good.
It's been a pleasure here talking with you. I'd like to explore that bootstrapper idea a minute, but don't have time.
Well, that's fine.
So thank you very much for being here with us today. And to the audience, thank you for joining us today on a visit with Dr. Jim Thorson, longtime professor of gerontology here at UN Omaha. We've been taking a look at some of the history of this university, UN Omaha, as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.